The German Empire did not collapse because of bombs and bullets, but began with the blood of Princess Irene. Instead of powerful successors, the obsession with pure bloodline produced children incapable of handling weapons. The Kaiser's greatest enemy lay not beyond its borders, but within the very genes of the family. Irene was born in 1866 into the Grand Ducal House of Hesse, a mid-sized German principality. Her mother was Princess Alice, Queen Victoria's second daughter. Alice was intelligent, sensitive, and deeply involved in public health and nursing, a thoroughly modern princess. She raised her children not in the stiff, distant manner of most royals, but with warmth, intimacy, and a hands-on approach that was almost shocking to the German aristocracy. Irene's childhood was, by all accounts, happy until it wasn't. The first shadow fell in 1878, when she was 12 years old. Diphtheria, the strangler angel of the Victorian age, swept through the Darmstadt palace. It was a chaotic, terrifying time. One by one, the children fell ill. Irene caught it. Her sisters caught it. Her father caught it. In the span of a few heartbreaking weeks, the disease claimed her youngest sister, 4-year-old Princess May, and then, devastatingly, her mother, Princess Alice. Alice died because she couldn't stop herself from comforting her grieving son, giving him the kiss of death that transferred the infection. This trauma defined Irene. At 12 years old, she watched the strongest pillar of her world, her mother, collapse. She learned early on that life was fragile and that health was a temporary illusion. But she also survived. She recovered fully from the diphtheria, emerging from the sick room while others were carried out in coffins. This reinforced the narrative that Irene was the survivor. She was the one with the constitution of iron. While her sister Alex grew up anxious and hypochondriac, and her brother Ernie was artistic and sensitive, Irene became the rock. She took on a maternal role, becoming the steadying force in a motherless household. She was the one who didn't complain. She was the one who could be relied upon. In the eyes of her grandmother, Queen Victoria, Irene was a model princess, practical, Protestant, and physically sound. But nature is cruel, and genetics do not care about character. While Irene was rebuilding her life and growing into a young woman, a silent biological mechanism was ticking away inside her cells. Hemophilia is a master of camouflage. Hemophilia is carried on the X chromosome. Women have 2 X chromosomes. Men have an X and a Y. The gene for hemophilia is recessive. This means that if you are a woman and you have one bad X chromosome carrying the mutation, you usually have a good backup X chromosome that produces enough clotting factor to keep your blood normal. You are a carrier. You don't bleed. You don't have joint pain. You are, for all intents and purposes, healthy. This was Irene. Her good X chromosome masked the bad one. She was an asymptomatic carrier. But men don't have a backup. They have one X and one Y. If a mother passes her bad X to her son, he has no second X to compensate. The disease manifests in its full brutal fury. His blood cannot clot. This is the cruelty of the royal disease. It targets the men, but it uses the women to travel. It turns women into unsuspecting transport vessels for agony. Queen Victoria was the source, a spontaneous mutation in her DNA, likely caused by the advanced age of her father at her conception, created the gene. She passed it to her son Leopold, who died young, and to 2 of her daughters, Alice and Beatrice. Alice, Irene's mother, had unknowingly passed it to Irene. Nobody knew. Well, they knew it was in the family. They knew Irene's brother Friddy had died of internal bleeding after a fall from a window years earlier. But in the 19th century, the understanding of heredity was a mix of folk wisdom and early science. They hoped it was a fluke. They prayed that the bad blood had died with Fritti. They looked at Irene, rosy-cheeked, energetic, capable Irene, and saw only vitality. It is chilling to think about the pressure placed on these royal women. Their primary, almost exclusive purpose was to breed. They were valuable because they could produce heirs. A princess was essentially a biological asset, traded across borders to mix bloodlines and secure treaties. The most important quality she could possess was purity. Purity. It's a word that appears constantly in the letters and diaries of the time. They wanted pure blood. They wanted a pure lineage. They wanted to avoid the mongrelization of the aristocracy. The irony is staggering. In their obsession with keeping their blood pure and blue, they were actually concentrating a poison. By marrying only within their own small circle of elite families, they were creating a genetic echo chamber. They weren't filtering out weaknesses, they were magnifying them. Irene was the ultimate example of this trap. She was praised for her impeccable lineage. She was a granddaughter of the Queen of England and the Grand Duke of Hesse. You couldn't get more royal than that. She was seen as the ideal genetic partner for a high-ranking prince. As she entered her 20s, the question of her marriage became a matter of international politics. She was not a ravishing beauty who turned heads with her glamour. She was too modest for that. But she had a quiet dignity and a reputation for stability that was incredibly attractive to the chaotic courts of Europe. She was seen as a woman who could anchor a man who could run a household, and most importantly, who could populate a nursery with strong sons. The perfect host was ready. The trap was set. The tragedy is that Irene herself had no idea. She was just a young woman, likely traumatized by her childhood losses, looking for stability and love. She didn't know that she was walking around with a loaded gun in her DNA. She didn't know that the very thing that made her a desirable bride, her royal blood, was the thing that would destroy her life. She was a ghost ship, sailing into the harbor of a new life, carrying a cargo that no one could see until the hatches were open. And the person she would open those hatches for, the man she would choose to love, was not a stranger from a distant land. He was someone she had known her entire life. He was family, and that was the final fatal mistake. If you wanted to design a trap for a dynasty, you wouldn't use a bomb or a revolution. You would use a mirror. You would convince the most powerful people on earth that the only safe reflection, the only worthy partner, was one that looked exactly like them. In the late 19th century, the royal houses of Europe were suffering from a collective delusion. They called it Ebenbürtigkeit, the principle of equality of birth. It was a rigid, unyielding law that dictated a royal could only marry another royal. To marry a commoner, or even a lesser noble, was to dilute the divine potency of the bloodline. It was viewed not just as a social faux pas, but as a dereliction of duty, a weakening of the structural integrity of the monarchy. So they looked inward. They turned their family trees into circles. Princess Irene found her mirror in Prince Heinrich of Prussia. The tragedy of their union is that it wasn't a cold, forced arrangement. If it had been a loveless political match, perhaps we could dismiss it as a mere transaction, but it wasn't. It was a love match, and that makes the biological betrayal that followed infinitely more painful. Heinrich was the younger brother of the future Kaiser Wilhelm II. But where Wilhelm was bombastic, insecure, and obsessed with pomp, Heinrich was the cool brother. He was the first royal to truly embrace the 20th century before it even arrived. He was a man of the sea and the machine. He loved the smell of engine grease and the salt spray of the Baltic. He was one of the first car enthusiasts in Germany, a pilot, a naval officer who felt more at home on the bridge of a torpedo boat than in the velvet stifle of a ballroom. He was charming, popular, and famously unpretentious. He was also Irene's first cousin. Their mothers, Princess Alice and Empress Victoria, were sisters. Irene and Heinrich shared a grandmother, Queen Victoria. They shared a grandfather, Prince Albert. They shared a history, a language, and a genetic code that was dangerously similar. In the eyes of their families, this closeness was a feature, not a bug. The royal matchmaking machine, presided over by an aging Queen Victoria from Windsor Castle, viewed this union as ideal. It was safe. It kept the property in the family. It cemented the bond between the liberal houses of Hesse and the militaristic house of Prussia. It was a consolidation of power. They were known in the family as the very amiables. They were the nice couple, the ones who didn't scheme, the ones who just wanted to live a quiet life of domestic contentment. When they announced their engagement, the courts of Europe breathed a sigh of relief. Here was a stable couple. Here was the future of the German respectable monarchy. They married on May 24, 1888, at Charlottenburg Palace in Berlin. The timing was ominous, though they tried to ignore it. 1888 is known in German history as the year of the three emperors. Heinrich's father, the liberal and kind Kaiser Frederick III, was dying of throat cancer even as the wedding took place. He would be dead within weeks, leaving the throne to Heinrich's unstable brother, Wilhelm. The wedding was celebrated under a black cloud of impending grief, a desperate attempt to assert life in the face of death. But the real shadow over the wedding wasn't the dying emperor. It was the bride's DNA. When Irene and Heinrich stood at the altar, they represented the pinnacle of the European eugenics experiment of the time. The belief that by breeding the best with the best, you created a superior human. They were wrong. By breeding the same with the same, they were removing the biological safety nets that evolution had built over millions of years. While hemophilia is a sex-linked trait passed from mother to son, meaning Heinrich didn't contribute the gene itself, the culture of consanguinity is what sealed their fate. In a wider world, Irene might have married a man from a different gene pool, a man whose family history didn't overlap with hers. But by marrying her cousin, she was locking herself into a closed loop. They were doubling down on the Victorian heritage. They were concentrating the legacy of their grandmother. They were building a genetic echo chamber where there was no fresh air to dilute the errors of the past. The first year of marriage was the honeymoon period, a time of naive bliss. Irene adapted well to life in Kiel, the naval base where Heinrich was stationed. It was a relief to be away from the stifling intrigue of Berlin. Here, she could be a naval wife, tending to her garden, riding her horses, and waiting for her husband to return from his voyages. Then came the pregnancies. The first child is always a test. For a royal woman, it is the moment of truth. Will it be a boy? Will he be healthy? Prince Waldemar was born in 1889, a son, the heir. The dynasty was secure. There was rejoicing in Kiel and Berlin. Heinrich was a proud father, doting on his boy. Irene was the fulfilled mother. But the perfect host had begun to unload her cargo. It didn't happen all at once. Hemophilia is a ghost that manifests slowly. A newborn baby doesn't move much, so they don't bruise much. It's when they start to engage with the world that the world starts to hurt them. As Waldemar grew from an infant to a crawler, the signs began to appear. Dark, angry bruises that bloomed under his skin from the slightest touch. A bump on the changing table that resulted in a swelling the size of an egg. Gums that oozed blood for days after a new tooth broke through. Irene must have felt a cold hand grip her heart the first time she saw a bruise that wouldn't fade. She knew this pattern. She remembered her childhood in Darmstadt. She remembered her little brother Friddy crying in agony, his joints swollen before he fell from that window and bled to death in her mother's arms. She had prayed it was a fluke. She had prayed that the Hesse curse had died with her mother. But biology does not answer prayers. It answers only to the laws of inheritance. The diagnosis, when it came, was a whispered devastation. The doctors, grave men with beards and pince-nez glasses, would have spoken in euphemisms. They wouldn't have wanted to offend the brother of the Kaiser. But the truth was undeniable. Waldemar had the bleeding disease. The joy of the young marriage was instantly punctured. The very amiables had produced a defective heir, but they tried again. They had to. The drive to produce a healthy spare, to outrun the genetics, was strong. In 1896, Prince Sigismund was born. Irene must have held her breath for months, watching his skin, checking his joints. Miraculously, Sigismund was healthy. He had won the coin toss. He didn't have the disease. This false hope is perhaps the cruelest part of the trap. It made them think they could beat the odds. It made them think that perhaps Waldemar was the exception, and that the pure blood of the Hohenzollerns was strong enough to overcome the taint. So they had a third child. Prince Heinrich, named after his father, was born in 1900. He was a golden child, beautiful, bright-eyed, engaging. The family adored him, but the coin toss failed them again. It soon became apparent that little Heinrich was also a bleeder, and his case seemed even more severe than Waldemar's. By 1900, the trap had fully sprung. Irene and Heinrich, the couple who married to secure the line and preserve the purity of their blood, found themselves the wardens of a hospital nursery. 2 out of their 3 sons were walking time bombs. The psychological shift in the household was absolute. The carefree naval life in Kiel evaporated, replaced by a regime of terrifying vigilance. The home became a fortress against the physical world. Sharp corners were padded. Floors were carpeted thick. Rough play was forbidden. This is where the trap of their marriage became a prison. In a normal family, a sick child is a tragedy. In a royal family, specifically a German royal family obsessed with militaristic strength, a sick son is a disgrace. Irene looked at her husband, a man of action, a sailor, a man who valued physical toughness, and she looked at the sons she had given him, sons who could never be soldiers, sons who could never command a ship, sons who might die from a nosebleed. She saw the love in his eyes, but she also saw the pity. And deep down, fueled by the whispers of the court and the rigid scientific racism of the era, she began to believe the terrible lie, that she had tricked him, that her beautiful exterior was a fraud, that she had lured him into a marriage of equals, only to reveal that her blood was broken. The very amiables were still amiable. They still loved each other. But the air in the palace at Kiel had changed. It was no longer the fresh, salty air of the Baltic. It was heavy, stagnant, and smelled faintly of iron. The modern world that Heinrich loved, the world of cars and engines and speed, was moving forward. But inside their home they were dragged back into the ancient primal muck of genetic failure. They had wanted to build a legacy. Instead, they had built a waiting room for death. And the death was not going to be polite. It was not going to be the noble death of a soldier on a battlefield, which was the only kind of death the Prussian court respected. It was going to be messy, painful, and slow. The trap was not just that the children were sick. The trap was that Irene and Heinrich were royal. They had to keep up appearances. They had to smile for the cameras, wave from the balconies, and pretend that the House of Hohenzollern was as invincible as ever. They had to display their perfect family to the public, while privately knowing that a single stumble, a single loose carpet, a single moment of childish clumsiness could bring the whole facade crashing down in a pool of blood. The genetic lock had clicked shut. There was no way out. There was only the waiting. For Princess Irene, horror didn't look like a dungeon or a mad scientist's lab. It looked like a pristine, sunlit nursery. It smelled of lavender water and expensive soap. It was quiet, polite, and absolutely terrifying. The true horror of hemophilia in the early 20th century was not in the blood you could see, it was in the blood you couldn't. There is a misconception about bleeders, that their danger lies in paper cuts or nosebleeds. While those external wounds were dangerous, they could be managed with pressure and bandages. The real nightmare was the internal betrayal. The real nightmare, the one that kept Irene awake in the dead of night, was the internal betrayal. The human body is a machine of constant impact. When we walk, our joints grind together. When we jump, our organs jostle. In a healthy body, microscopic tears in the capillaries are instantly sealed by clotting factors. It happens thousands of times a day, and we never notice. For Irene's sons, Waldemar and little Heinrich, those microscopic tears didn't seal. They stayed open. The horror began with the joints. It is a condition known as hemarthrosis. It usually starts with a funny feeling, a slight tingling or warmth in a knee or an elbow. For a child, it's confusing. For a mother who knows the signs, it is the sound of a siren. Within hours, the joint begins to fill with blood. Since the blood cannot clot, it acts like a hydraulic press inside the body. It fills the joint capsule, stretching the skin until it is shiny, taut, and hot to the touch. The pressure is excruciating. Imagine the pain of a severe sprain, then magnify it and sustain it for days. The pooling blood begins to corrode the cartilage and bone, eating away at the skeleton from the inside out. The child screams. They don't just cry, they scream in a high rhythmic pitch that indicates primal suffering. And the most terrifying part for Irene was the impotence of the remedy. This was the Edwardian era. There were no clotting factor infusions. There was no cure. The most powerful doctors in the German Empire, men who could transplant organs in dogs and identify bacteria under microscopes, were reduced to medieval bystanders in the face of this genetic sabotage. Their prescription was always the same: immobilization, ice, morphine. Irene became less of a mother and more of a warden. Her life was measured in doses of opium derivatives administered to toddlers. She had to strap her son's legs into heavy splints to prevent them from moving, forcing active young boys to lie perfectly still for weeks on end, while their bodies slowly reabsorbed the spilled blood. She sat by their bedsides, reading stories, wiping sweat from their foreheads, listening to the shallow breathing of a drug-induced sleep, knowing that she had transmitted the code that was causing this torture. But the joints were manageable. You could survive a destroyed knee. You could survive a fused elbow. The real terror was the head. February 1904. The winter in Kiel was gray and biting. Prince Heinrich, Irene's youngest son, was 4 years old. He was the light of the house. By all accounts, he was a spirited, engaging child who hadn't yet learned to fear his own body. He didn't understand why he couldn't play like his cousins. He didn't understand the invisible bubble his mother tried to build around him. The accident was so trivial that it defies the weight of the tragedy it caused. It wasn't a horse riding accident or a fall from a high balcony. He was climbing, perhaps onto a chair, perhaps onto a table. The records are blurry on the furniture, but sharp on the outcome. He slipped. He fell. He bumped his head. In any other nursery in Germany, a 4-year-old bumping his head results in a wail, a kiss from calm Mutti, and a colorful bruise that fades in a week. Irene rushed to him. She checked him frantically. There was no gash. There was no blood on the carpet. For a fleeting, desperate moment, she must have hoped. But within an hour, the signs appeared. The lucid interval is a concept well known in trauma medicine. It is the period after a head injury where the patient seems fine, before the pooling blood in the brain reaches a critical mass. Little Heinrich started to complain of a headache. Then he became drowsy. The sparkle left his eyes, replaced by a glassy, confused stare. He started to vomit, a classic sign of increased intracranial pressure. The horror of an epidural or subdural hematoma in a hemophiliac is a slow-motion execution. The blood vessel inside the skull had torn. Slowly, steadily, the blood was pumping out, forming a lake that pressed against the soft tissue of the brain. The skull is a fixed box. It does not expand. As the blood took up more space, the brain was being crushed. Irene summoned the doctors. They arrived in their black coats, bringing with them the smell of carbolic acid and tobacco. They examined the boy. They checked his pupils. One was likely blown wide, dilated, and unresponsive, indicating which side of the brain was being compressed. And then they stood back. There was nothing they could do. Trepanation, drilling a hole in the skull to relieve pressure, was a known procedure, but on a hemophiliac child it was a death sentence. The surgery itself would cause uncontrollable bleeding. If they cut him, he would bleed to death. If they didn't cut him, the pressure would kill him. Irene was forced to act as a spectator to her son's death. The trajectory of the end was brutal. As the pressure on the brainstem increased, the boy's breathing changed. Cheney-Stokes respiration. A terrifying pattern of deep, fast breaths, followed by long pauses of silence where the mother waits, praying for the next inhale. Then came the seizures, the delicate electrical storm of the brain, misfiring under the crushing weight of the blood. Irene held his hand, or perhaps she was held back by her husband, Prince Heinrich, who was watching his namesake destroyed by an invisible enemy. The agony lasted for hours. The child slipped into a coma, a mercy that silenced his cries, but signaled the end. Prince Heinrich of Prussia, aged 4, died on February 26, 1904. He didn't die of a disease he caught from the street. He didn't die of an infection. He died because his own blood, the pure, royal blood that was so celebrated by his family, drowned his brain. The funeral was a blur of black crepe and muffled drums. The Kaiser came. The family stood in stiff, stoic formation. But for Irene, something fundamental shattered that day. She had looked into the abyss of medical horror, and she realized that the abyss was inside her. She was the carrier. Her body was the factory that had produced the flaw. The guilt was no longer a vague anxiety. It was a heavy, suffocating cloak that she would wear for the rest of her life. But she couldn't collapse. She couldn't follow her sister Alex's path into hysteria, because she still had Waldemar. Waldemar was 15 years old when his little brother died. He saw it all. He saw the fall. He saw the decline. He saw the coffin. And he understood with the crystal clarity of a teenager that he was next. The life of Prince Waldemar became a study in survival horror. He was the boy in the bubble before the term existed. After Heinrich's death, Irene's protectiveness turned into a mania. Waldemar was not allowed to run. He was not allowed to play sports. He was barely allowed to walk on uncarpeted surfaces. His life was stripped of all physical spontaneity. Imagine being a teenage boy in Prussia, a society that worshipped the military. Your cousins are wearing uniforms, learning to fence, learning to ride chargers, preparing to lead regiments. You are wrapped in cotton wool, treated like a piece of fragile porcelain. Waldemar grew up watching his body with the paranoia of a bomb disposal expert. Every morning he had to scan himself for bruises. Every sensation of stiffness was analyzed. Is my knee tight? Is my elbow warm? He survived childhood, which was a statistical miracle, but survival came at a terrible cost. His joints were ravaged by repeated microbleeds. By the time he was a young man, he walked with the stiff, halting gait of an old man. His knees were fused, his range of motion limited. He lived in a state of chronic, low-level pain, punctuated by episodes of acute agony. The medical horror for Waldemar wasn't a single dramatic event like his brother's death. It was the slow erosion of his humanity. He became a medical curiosity, a case, rather than a prince. The doctors of the time, frustrated by their inability to cure him, often subjected hemophiliacs to experimental treatments that bordered on torture. They tried injecting snake venom to promote clotting. They tried transfusing animal blood. They used blistering agents on the skin to draw out the inflammation. We don't know the full extent of the therapies Waldemar endured, but the history of hemophilia treatment in that era is a catalog of desperation and pain. And through it all, the specter of the next bleed hung over the palace. It created a bizarre domestic atmosphere. On the surface, things were regal. Servants brought tea on silver trays. They dressed for dinner. But underneath, everyone was waiting for the scream. If a door slammed too hard, Irene would jump. If Waldemar was 5 minutes late for lunch, panic would set in. The perfect host had become a jailer. Irene loved Waldemar with a ferocity that was frightening, but it was a love born of terror. She suffocated him to save him. As Waldemar reached adulthood, the world around them began to descend into its own kind of madness, the First World War. But while Europe bled on the battlefields of the Somme and Verdun, suffering the industrial slaughter of machine guns and gas, Waldemar was fighting a lonely private war in his own veins. He wanted to serve. He begged to be given a commission to do something for the fatherland, like his father and uncles. But he was rejected. The German army had no use for a prince who could be killed by a bruise. This rejection was another kind of wound, a psychological hemorrhage. He was a Hohenzollern who could not fight. He was a prince without a sword. So he retreated into books, into quiet hobbies, into the safe, suffocating world his mother had built for him. He and Irene were locked together in a dance of mutual survival. She watched him. He allowed himself to be watched. They were survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to the raft while the sharks circled in the water below. The medical horror of their lives was the absence of peace. There was never a day off. There was never a moment where they could say, "We are safe." The biological flaw was woven into every minute of their existence. It was in the proteins of their blood, undeniable and inescapable. The death of little Heinrich had shown them the face of the monster. It was a monster that struck from within, turning a child's playful tumble into a fatal tragedy. And Waldemar knew every time he took a step that the monster was walking right beside him, waiting for him to stumble. If the physical pain of hemophilia was a fire that burned the body, the psychological pain was a cold, damp fog that rotted the soul. For Princess Irene, the death of her 4-year-old son Heinrich was not the end of the suffering. It was the beginning of the silence. In the great echoing halls of the Prussian palaces, a new kind of wall was built around her, a wall of polite exclusion and whispered disdain. The Germany of the early 20th century was a nation drunk on the idea of strength. Under the bombastic rule of her brother-in-law Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German Empire was obsessed with physical vigor, military prowess, and the genetic superiority of the Teutonic race. It was a culture of dueling scars, polished boots, and steel. In this world, a prince who could not hold a sword was worse than useless. He was an embarrassment. Irene had failed in her primary biological duty. She had not produced the requisite warrior sons for the fatherland. Instead, she had brought what the German court sneeringly called die English Krankheit, the English sickness. The slur was devastatingly effective because it was true. The disease did come from England. It came from her grandmother, Queen Victoria. As tensions between Germany and Britain rose in the years leading up to World War I, Irene found herself doubly stigmatized. She was not only the carrier of a physical defect, she was the carrier of a foreign contaminant. The whispers followed her down the corridors. The Hessian woman, they would say, has tainted the blood of the Hohenzollerns. She was viewed as a biological saboteur. The purity that had been the rationale for her marriage had inverted. She was now the pollution. This external judgment seeped into her internal monologue until it became her own voice. Irene began to view herself not as a victim of genetics, but as a perpetrator of a crime. Every time she looked at Waldemar hobbling on his stiff, ruined knees, she didn't just see a sick child, she saw the evidence of her own bad blood. She was the poisoner of her own children. This guilt transformed her. The warm, practical girl from Darmstadt calcified into a rigid, anxious woman. She retreated from the glittering court life in Berlin. Why go to balls where other mothers boasted of their sons' commissions in the Hussars or the Navy? Why attend parades where Waldemar could only watch from a wheelchair or a distant window? She withdrew to Hemophilia, their estate in the north. It became her sanctuary and her prison. There she could control the environment. She could ensure that no one bumped into Waldemar. She could pretend, if only for a few hours a day, that they were a normal family. But the isolation bred a dark, claustrophobic intensity. The bond between Irene and Waldemar became suffocating. They were co-conspirators in survival. She watched him with the eyes of a hawk. He allowed himself to be watched. Having internalized the fear that the world was made of glass and he was made of stone, then the world shattered. August 1914. World War I began, the War of Cousins. For Irene, this was the ultimate psychological torture. Her husband, Prince Heinrich, was the Grand Admiral of the German Navy. He was fighting for Germany. But the enemy? The enemy was her family. King George V of England was her first cousin. The Tsarina Alexandra of Russia was her sister. She was an English princess by blood, a German princess by marriage, and a sister to the Empress of the enemy in the East. While the rest of Germany was gripped by patriotic fervor, Irene was paralyzed. Every shell fired by a German ship was aimed at her relatives. Every victory for her husband was a defeat for her blood. The war brought a new, sharper edge to the stigma against her. In Berlin, hatred for England reached a fever pitch. The Kaiser even changed the family names to sound less British. Irene, with her English accent and her Victorian mannerisms, was a walking reminder of the enemy. She was isolated even further, viewed with suspicion by the very people she had lived among for decades. But the true horror of the war years for Irene wasn't political. It was personal. It was the mirror image of her own nightmare playing out in Russia. Her sister Alex, Empress Alexandra of Russia, was living Irene's life, but on a catastrophic scale. Alex also had a hemophiliac son, the Tsarevich Alexei. Irene received letters smuggled through neutral countries or delivered by diplomats detailing the horror in St. Petersburg. She read about Alexei's bleeding attacks, which were so severe that the screams of the heir to the Russian throne could be heard throughout the palace. She read about Alex's descent into madness, her reliance on the holy man Rasputin, her hysterical conviction that only a miracle could save her son. Irene saw her own reflection in a cracked mirror. She saw what happened when you let the fear take over completely. She saw how the curse of their blood was not just killing a boy, It was bringing down an empire. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and the subsequent murder of the Romanov family in 1918 broke Irene. When the news finally reached her that Alex, her husband Nicky, and all 5 of their beautiful children, including the sick boy Alexei, had been gunned down in a cellar in Ekaterinburg, it confirmed her deepest, darkest fear. The world did not forgive weakness. The world did not forgive bad blood. The Romanovs died because they were symbols of a hated regime, yes, but in Irene's mind the tragedy was inextricably linked to the disease. The hemophilia had weakened the Tsar's authority. It had driven the Empress mad. It had allowed a charlatan like Rasputin to destroy the reputation of the monarchy. The gene hadn't just killed the boy, it had killed the dynasty. Irene looked at Waldemar, safe for now in Hemmelmark, and wondered if the same fate awaited them. Germany had lost the war, the Kaiser had fled, the monarchy was abolished, revolution was in the air. Would they come for her broken son next? The post-war years were a gray wasteland for Irene. The golden 20s roared in Berlin, but in Hemmelmark time stood still. They lived in reduced circumstances, stripping the estate of servants they could no longer afford. Waldemar was now a man in his 30s, but he was effectively a child in the eyes of the world. He had no profession. He had no wife. Who would marry a bleeder and risk passing the curse to another generation? He was a ghost in his own life. Irene watched him fade. He was intelligent, sensitive, and desperate to be useful, but his body was his cage. He spent his days arranging books, managing the small details of the estate, and nursing his chronic pain. The psychological hell for Irene was the knowledge that she had robbed him of a life. She had given him existence, but she had denied him the ability to live it. Every time he looked at her with his sad, resigned eyes, she felt the accusation. You made me this way. And then the shadows lengthened even further. The 1930s arrived, the rise of the Third Reich. If the Kaiser's court had despised weakness, the Nazis wanted to eradicate it. The Nazi ideology of racial hygiene was the ultimate manifestation of the purity obsession that had caused the tragedy in the first place. The Nazis preached the elimination of life unworthy of life. They sterilized the disabled. They euthanized the mentally ill and the genetically defective. Irene and Heinrich were old now. They were relics of a bygone era, but they understood the danger. Their son, a pure-blooded German prince, was exactly the kind of defective the new regime hated. Waldemar was a hemophiliac. In the eyes of the party, he was a genetic error. The fear in Hemmelmark changed from a fear of gravity, of falls and bumps, to a fear of men in black uniforms. Irene had to navigate a terrifying diplomatic dance. She had to use her remaining status, her connections, and the memory of her husband's service to shield her son from the scrutiny of the state. She became a recluse, hiding Waldemar away not just from the physical world, but from the political one. The estate became a bunker. The psychological toll of this decades-long siege is unimaginable. For 50 years, Irene had lived in a state of high alert, first guarding against the physical accidents of childhood, then guarding against the stigma of the court, now guarding against a murderous government that viewed her son's blood as a crime against the state. She was tired. Her soul was worn thin. She had outlived her sister Alex. She had outlived her sister Ella. She had outlived her brother Ernie. She was the last guardian of a tragic legacy, and she was alone. Her husband, Prince Heinrich, the only person who truly understood the burden, died of throat cancer in 1929. His death removed the last buffer between Irene and the world. She was left alone with Waldemar, two survivors clinging to each other in a house that was too big, too quiet, and filled with ghosts. She must have looked back at those wedding photos from 1888, the very amiables, young and hopeful, and wondered how a love so pure could have led to a darkness so absolute. She had wanted to be a good wife and mother. She had wanted to be the perfect host for the next generation of kings. Instead, she had become the curator of a museum of sorrow. The year 1945 did not dawn, it exploded. The Third Reich was collapsing. From the east, the Soviet Red Army was rolling across the plains like a tidal wave of steel and vengeance. From the west, the Allies were closing the Weiss. Germany was a landscape of burning cities, refugee columns, and desperation. For Princess Irene, now 78 years old, this was the apocalypse she had feared since 1918. But her terror wasn't political. It was specific. It was focused entirely on the middle-aged man sitting beside her in the back of a requisitioned car. Prince Waldemar was 56. In the timeline of a hemophiliac born in the 19th century, he was ancient. He was a medical anomaly, a man who had survived simply because he had been kept in a gilded cage for half a century. But now the cage was broken, and he was being forced out into the jagged, violent world. They were fleeing toward Bavaria, hoping to find sanctuary in the American occupation zone. The journey was a nightmare of potholed roads, freezing temperatures, and constant stops. For a healthy man, it was exhausting. For Waldemar, whose joints were fused and fragile, whose body was a roadmap of old traumas, the physical stress was catastrophic. It wasn't a bullet that killed him. It wasn't a bomb. It was the vibration of the car. It was the cold. It was the sheer exhaustion of movement. Somewhere on the road to Tutzing, the familiar, terrifying heat began in his gut. Internal bleeding is a thief. It steals your life quietly, drop by drop, from the inside. Waldemar knew the sensation. He had lived with it his entire life. But this time, there was no palace to retreat to. There was no ice. There was no morphine. They arrived at a clinic in Tutzing, a picturesque town by a lake that had been turned into a grim waiting room for the dead. The clinic was overwhelmed. Wounded soldiers lay in the corridors. The smell of gangrene and unwashed bodies filled the air. Irene, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, the sister of an empress, stood in the chaos, begging for help. The tragedy of Waldemar's death is a masterpiece of cruel irony. By 1945, science had solved the riddle of his blood. Doctors knew about blood types. They knew about transfusions. In a well-stocked American or British hospital, Waldemar's life could have been saved with a few bags of plasma. But in the ruins of Nazi Germany, blood was more precious than gold. Every drop of plasma was earmarked for the Wehrmacht, for the soldiers fighting the futile last stand. There was none to spare for a dying middle-aged prince with a useless hereditary disease. Irene watched history repeat itself one last time. Just as she had sat by the bed of 4-year-old Heinrich in 1904, she now sat by the bed of 56-year-old Waldemar. The horror was the same, only the scale had changed. Waldemar didn't scream. He was too weak, too resigned. He simply faded. The blood drained from his circulation into his abdomen, starving his heart and brain. He lay in a cot amidst the groans of dying soldiers and looked at his mother. He was the last testament to her life's work. She had kept him alive through wars, revolutions, and pandemics. She had shielded him from the world for 5 decades. But she couldn't shield him from this. On May 2nd, 1945, as Berlin fell to the Russians and Hitler lay dead in his bunker, Prince Waldemar of Prussia died of unchecked internal bleeding. He bled out until he was empty. Irene was the last one left. She was a carrier. The genetic trait that had killed her sons protected her. Her blood clotted perfectly. Her heart beat strongly. She was biologically built to survive, even when she had nothing left to survive for. She buried Waldemar in the chaotic days after the surrender. There was no state funeral, no flags, no honor guard, just a quick burial in a broken country. Princess Irene lived for another 8 years. She returned to the north, to the estate at Hemophilia. She lived alone. The silence in the house must have been deafening. She was surrounded by the portraits of the dead, her mother Alice, her brother Friddy, her sister Alex, her sister Ella, her husband Heinrich, her son Heinrich, her son Waldemar. She was a ghost haunting her own life. Visitors who saw her in the late 1940s and early 1950s described a woman of immense dignity, but profound sadness. She spent her days walking the grounds, a solitary figure in black, looking out at the gray waters of the Baltic. She died on November 11th, 1953, at the age of 87. The story of Princess Irene is the ultimate rebuttal to the obsession with purity. The royal houses of Europe spent centuries building high walls to keep their bloodlines clean. They married cousin to cousin, niece to uncle, believing that they were concentrating greatness. They thought they were brewing an elixir of power. Instead, they were brewing a poison. Irene was the perfect host in the most tragic sense of the word. She was healthy, strong, and loving. She did everything she was raised to do, but her body was a delivery system for a biological curse that no amount of wealth or titles could bribe. Her life strips away the romance of royalty and leaves us with the cold, hard reality of medical horror. It wasn't a horror of monsters, but of mathematics, the probability of the gene, the pressure of the blood, the fragility of the vessel. In the end, Irene's legacy isn't written in treaties or statues. It is written in the silence of a nursery where a child never grew up, and in the empty room of a clinic where a man died because the world had no blood left to give him. She was a woman who loved her family enough to kill them and strong enough to watch them die. That was the paradox of the royal blood. That was the price of the crown. And Irene paid it drop by drop for 87 years,